fundraising at seed stage is like all about momentum. I mean, maybe at every stage, but especially at seed stage. Because, if you are, there is like this game theory perspective where like an investor's incentive is to wait as long as possible, because like every month you wait, you get an extra piece of data. Yeah. You also have this like massive disincentive as an investor that you don't want to be the only check in the round. And that's happened to me a few times where like, someone's like, oh, I'm raising $2 million. I'm like, sure, I'll give you like 50K. And then like they end up raising 200K and they don't have enough money to make that startup successful. So my 50K is just like this orphan. And like in 2021, it didn't matter because everyone was able to raise whatever the hell they wanted. But right now and pre 2020, it was a factor that like you don't want to be the only one in the round, or you don't want the round to not be complete. So the combination of those two factors, like you get more information over time and you don't want to be the only investor, means that like the incentive for investors is to wait. So the only way the founder can break this incentive is to just talk to so many investors that you create this like momentum that's like self-fulfilling. Because like,
so how do you do that?
In general, it's hard, but if you're using raised seed by itself, it's maybe not enough. Like we send you to 500 investors, but if you're using it in conjunction with a round, like it can help like give you that extra push. How do you do that? I think step one, which I think a lot of early entrepreneurs miss, is like you want to have a really good network of entrepreneurs. So I think like sometimes people try to build a network of investors. I think that's actually much harder as an early entrepreneur, but like knowing a lot of entrepreneurs is not that hard. Like you just show up at events, you like, most early entrepreneurs are willing to be helpful. Like everyone's like been through that journey. You find people that are like close to your space. You go through, ideally you go through YC or something like that. That helps a lot. So that's step one, because most entrepreneurs that have raised a seed round know at least 10 investors, right? So if you know 10 of them and they know 10 investors, that's like maybe 100 investors right there. And most of the time as an investor, I feel like you almost have a legal obligation to look at an email from a portfolio company founder, right? Otherwise, like, what the hell are you doing? So I think that's step one. Like you want to have a good network of entrepreneurs that can connect you to investors. And then step two is like, you get all your ducks in a row. Like you write the deck, you go pitch it to some of your friends, you pitch it to your wife, whatever, right? Like make sure that you're like pretty solid story. You try to de-risk it as much as possible to like make sure you can, ideally you're selling a good product to investors. And then I try to like compress it all down into like a 2-week period where you just go completely crazy. Like ideally you're doing like 5 meetings a day for 2 weeks, right? So that's like 5 times 5 times 2, whatever that is, 50 meetings. And that kind of momentum, like I think your pitch, at least when I'm pitching something, it just gets better and better. Like if I do it again and again in this like very quick time period, because like they'll ask you questions and then eventually you get to a position where you've just memorized the pitch. So like you can completely focus on what the investor's saying. You don't need to think about what you're saying. Okay. And that's like a very different mode of operating versus like, actually I'm like pitching and I'm trying to remember what I was supposed to say at this point.
Yeah. They asked the wrong question and it threw me off.
Exactly. Like you want the pitch to be automatic and like you want to be focused on like actually answering. When an investor asks you a question, you don't want to answer the question. You want to answer like what the question they're trying to ask. Like if the investor is like, oh, how will you get your first user? You don't want to answer like, how will you get your first user? You want to answer it with like, hey, my distribution strategy is X. Like I'm expecting my CAC to be Y. And like, you don't want to answer the literal question. You want to answer the question behind the question. Yeah. But it's hard to do that when you're like very focused on like the pitch part. So that's one part. Like your pitching gets way better. And then the second part is you can build up this momentum. If you do 50 things, like, if all of them said no, you probably got some issues anyway. Even if your hit rate's only 10%, that would mean like in the first 4 or 5 days, you'll get like 3 or 4 like commitments. And then the next week you do the pitching, you're like, hey, blah is in, like, then you've got momentum. And then the second bit of like the investor mindset kicks in, which is FOMO. And that's what you need to create to get a seed round done. Like I don't think very many seed rounds get done with like without some FOMO. Like you want the investor to go like, shit, like this round is happening. Like if I don't jump on the train, I'm not going to get my allocation. Like